Morning again. The topic I want to explore with you all today is shaping what shapes us. Shaping what shapes us. I want to suggest this as one way we can understand the work of spiritual practice that we are focusing on this month. The work of shaping for a change, and even if just for a few moments, not our external world, our external realities, but rather our minds, our hearts, our very perception. Shaping ourselves spiritually, rather than trying to conform our world to meet our hopes and wishes. This is the work of spiritual practice I want to lift up today, and I want to engage and explore this work in dialogue with the work that we are doing all year long, and at least all year long. We're naming it especially this year, of facing honestly where we reside in the gaps. In the gaps, for example, between what we hope for, between how we wish we could shape our world, our lives, and where we actually find ourselves, the often painful experience of living in those gaps. And facing that honestly by cultivating our trust in love's power to meet us in those gaps and transform our experiences there. Transform our experiences, not necessarily change the situation that we would hope to change. So, before I dive into the exploration of how spiritual practice can be a foundational way that we let go of our resistance to the truth of our life in the gaps and instead allow love to meet us there and shape our experience, I want to engage in a spiritual practice that I hold dear, which is the practice of giving some testimony this morning. I want to start out with a story, just one of many stories, for me personally, of how love met me in the gap and completely transformed my experience there. The gap I want to tell you about takes place back in the days when I was working as an actor. Most of you know that before I gave in to this crazy call, this notion to become a minister, I had another crazy notion call to be a performer, to be an actor. And after struggling at first, as I've shared with some of you all here and other places, struggling initially after school with depression and not having the courage and the will to pursue my dream at that time. A couple years after school, I did finally take the plunge and I moved up to New York. And then, of course, I still struggled, as all people who engage in the show business do, with hearing no and no and no and no time after time, pounding the pavement until you heard the one little yes, the stepping stone, and then the next yes. And then finally, about a year and a half, close to 2 years in, I got my big break, my biggest break. I was cast as Tony in the European tour, the 50th anniversary Broadway European tour of West Side Story. I was going to be playing a role that felt made for me, a role of my dreams in some of the greatest houses in some of the greatest cities of Europe: Germany, Switzerland, Austria, Paris, France. It was a dream come true. About, just a few weeks into the tour, however, I fell ill. Just a cold at first. Nothing too threatening, but it turned into a sinus infection, and this role, which though felt made for me, also stretched me, became harder and harder. And I found myself falling out of my game, not able to hit the soaring high notes that the conductor and the audiences long to hear in Maria, Maria, Maria with the same strength. And I started fearing the consequences, that they might lose their confidence in me, the producers of this show. And I did everything in my power to try to regain my health. I tried every remedy known to the world of thespians. Do you all even know what that word is, thespians? I mean, I was gargling and drinking vinegar water with cayenne pepper. I was locking myself away on vocal rest. I was wrapping myself in every blanket you could find and trying to sweat it out. I was shutting myself away and turning into a recluse on vocal rest all the time. I also took antibiotics and eventually even steroids, oral steroids, prednisone, to try to reduce the inflammation in my cords. But eventually, what I feared took place, actually just as I was regaining my footing. They didn't want to take the risk that I would still be sick when we opened in Paris 1 week from our close in Vienna. And so they brought me into the producer's office and gave me a ticket home. Sent me packing, promising that it was just business. Of course, though, I was devastated. I had almost been able to feel the glow of my parents' pride sitting in Le Châtelet in Paris, France, this famous opera house, watching me, their son, perform one of the greatest roles of all time. But instead, I was going to be flying back a failure to New York City. But deep in that gap, once I had surrendered my power because I had to control that situation, love found me anyway. Walking amidst Vienna in the autumn, it was about this time of year, a little bit later, the trees in their golden glow of sunlit yellow enveloped me as if in an embrace that was meant just for me, saying, life is still here for you, the gift to be received. My castmates no longer were able to give me any remedies to the situation, but their tears did transform my own. A friend who had traveled to Vienna and who I'd expected mostly to be giving me applause with his hands instead held my hands in his and shared his love in that way. And my parents, their love and pride in me and who I was in facing what had come could be felt all the more strongly, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean than I'm sure it would have been felt in Le Châtelet. Now, of course, love didn't change the story. It didn't give me power to take my role back, but it transformed my perception. It transformed my experience of the story. And we all have these stories, I believe, of how love meets us in our losses, meets us deep in the gap places. But maybe your stories share something in common with mine. I'm curious, just as I'm curious if there's water here. There is. When you think of these stories in your own lives, is it possible that like you, like me, the surrendering of your control, which ultimately let the surrendering of your own power, which ultimately let the power of love rush in, is it possible that like me, that wasn't a voluntary choice? Is it possible that your experiences, your greatest experiences of love, the power of love breaking in when you encountered your own limits, were when you did exactly that? You bumped up against your limits. You didn't choose love, but instead were given love when your own power couldn't offer you what you wished. Spiritual practice is the courageous work of recognizing that in order to be shaped by this spiritual power of love, we talk about love as the spirit of this church, we have to practice surrendering our own power and letting love in, letting love be the experience that shapes us. And we have to practice it because we are, as humans, shaped by our experience. Knowing it cognitively, remembering it happened before isn't enough. We have to cultivate trust in it by doing just what we did back in our youth group ropes course experiences. Trust falling into it time and time again, choosing to trust in spiritual power over our own power. This really sunk home for me when I came to Harvard Divinity School after I'd made this crazy choice to pursue ministry, a choice that was prompted by those experiences of being met in the gaps by love, prompting me to want to meet others in the gaps with my own love. And I came to do this spiritual work, and I found myself very quickly overwhelmed because actually, in addition to doing the spiritual work of preparing to be a minister, it turns out I was at Harvard in graduate school, and I had a lot of homework. And I was taken aback when early on in my time there, one of my professors, actually the dean of ministry studies at Harvard Divinity School, said to us ministry students in our Intro to Ministries class, if we had the idea that in preparing to be spiritual leaders, that we would get around to having actual spiritual lives, spiritual practices, once we were, graduated and actually doing the work of ministry or whatever spiritual leadership we were called to, that we had another thing coming. He said, if we can't find time now, we never will. And he said that, in fact, spiritual people, as we imagine ourselves to be, aren't people who at some times express that spirituality by praying, perhaps, or by meditating, or reading or writing poetry, or taking walks in the woods mindfully, or whatever spiritual practices we might enjoy. But spiritual people, truly people that commit their lives to spiritual power, become that way by doing those things. That we become spiritual through prayer. We become spiritual through meditation. We become spiritual by regularly reading and writing poetry, by taking down a musical instrument and letting the beauty that we love shape us instead of trying to shape our world. That in fact, the chicken came before the egg, or at least for me and for many of us, this pattern was reversed. Practice preceded our becoming who we thought ourselves to be. So that began my own, for the first time, being kind of called out by my dean of ministry studies as potentially being a fraud if I didn't actually practice what I planned to preach, was enough of a nudge to get me, for the first time in my life, to try on the work of daily spiritual practices. And it's then when I realized just how key that ingredient in my original story of non-voluntary surrender was, because I could barely even surrender the 10 minutes in the morning that I'd committed to sit on the cushion when there was so much else that I had to do, so many other tasks, so much work that I needed to shape, so much of the world and my life that I needed to shape according to my needs. And I came to find that the greatest work of spiritual practice, of letting spiritual power in, was that work of surrendering my own agenda, surrendering my own devotion and commitment and belief in my power, and giving instead the opportunity for love to prove itself greater, for spiritual power to change the very way I thought and felt in the world. And it did. It does still. I still wrestle, though, greatly with that trust fall onto the cushion, or that trust fall into that time I set aside for music or for poetry. And perhaps that's why the greatest testimony that I've encountered along my journey for what this work of letting go of our own power and letting the power of love can do comes from an individual whose spiritual practice, as I understand it, was not voluntary. And I want to just share this last story of Justin with you before I close up. So, Justin, president, was a young man of 28 who had epilepsy, and who, very rare in the case of epilepsy, but possible, actually died during an epileptic seizure at that young age of 28. And Justin became the second individual that I ever did a memorial service for back when I was doing my internship at First Church in Boston. Justin, or Prez, as his friends called him, had lived up in Boston for many years, actually come up there for graduate school, having been raised in Virginia. So his parents decided that the friends that he had there, the dear friends that he had, would really be the best people to celebrate his life at this juncture. And so they looked to them to plan the memorial service, and in turn, these friends found First Church in Boston and myself to help with that. And I was blown away by their love for this young man. I was astonished by their stories. And then, when the time for the memorial came, by the literally hundreds of people that packed our sanctuary. How could he have touched so many people at just the age of 28? And time again, the story that everyone kept telling me about Justin was that this was the kind of guy who would hug you until you were done, who would not let go of his embrace until he was sure you got all the embrace, all the love that you needed out of that hug. You had to let go, maybe even push back sometimes. And as each individual came and told me this story as if it was special to them and as if Justin was their best friend, I began to marvel and wonder more and more, what was this guy's recipe? Like, how had he, for these people, been such a blessing, such a free spirit? To be honest, he was starting to sound a little bit like JC to me or something. And that's when I realized, as I heard some of their other stories, that another reality in Justin's life was that sometimes, even daily, Justin would lose all control over his body. He would have an epileptic seizure. And in those moments, Justin had to trust in a friend, a family member, or sometimes even a stranger to hold him in an embrace until he was finished. He had to trust in a power beyond his own, the power of love, to hold him when he couldn't control his own reality. And this practice, which he never chose, and which I don't want to romanticize, but this practice, I am quite sure, shaped Justin's heart by love so profoundly that it freed him to offer that love to the world. Now, I don't wish any kind of involuntary spiritual practice like that on any of you. But what if we could be so disciplined as to give our hearts, our minds, over to the power of love in that way daily, even just for 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, to abandon our love of power for the power of love just for that time? How might our hearts be shaped? What would that look like for you? It's good to be together. This time that we share once a week. This is a sacred practice we share to allow our lives to shape our lives by a community of love, and to trust that this is more important than any other agenda we might have on this Sunday morning. How can you take this kind of commitment you have to the practice we share of shaping what shapes us into your everyday life even more? What would the world look like if we all did that? Amen.
Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.